When it comes to justice in relation to our material world, most of us are finding that these days that we must expand our understanding of economics to include the so-called natural world, because that world is the world that we depend on every day for our existence. Doing justice to non-humans is one of those new agenda
Yes.
For us. Thomas Friedman, in a column in the New York Times recently, said, "We are now, as a world civilization, up against a wall. We are hitting the wall, which is the limitation on our ability to manage our affairs on the basis of more and more and more and more.
Yes, yes, yes.
We must find a way to do less and less and less.
Yes.
And we must find a way both to respect each other enough so that we don't exploit each other, so that some of us get rich while the other of us get poor. But that same rule applies to our environment. If we don't support that environment and its health, so to speak, we destroy ourselves.
Yes, yes, yes.
And I guess I'd like to ask you, how do we ever get into a fix in which we are in danger of fouling our own nest and indeed creating an economy which is not supportive very much longer? How do we get this way?
Well, I mean, you have to go into a deep history here. Most people have been very poor. Most societies in historical times have been divided into a tiny group of very rich people, 5%, 2%, and 80 or 90% of the people who are really on the borderline of starvation. So poverty has been the norm. And nobody who's that poor wants to stay that way. And they've always had fantasies about kings and queens and princes who had everything they wanted. And because they would like to have that too. In all traditional societies, you have folk tales about kings and so on. And we have created a society which, though far from egalitarian, equality has not been fulfilled as a central concern, nonetheless has raised the level of the poorest people more than most societies in history. Poverty is still present among us, and some of it is very grinding and very unjust. And at this point, I think we have to, and so my point is that the notion that if everybody gets more, if everybody can share in the wealth that traditional societies have had only for the aristocracy, that's a good thing. And can either of us say that's not a good thing? To pull people out of being on the verge of starvation is certainly a good thing.
The Bible does not celebrate poverty, does it?
No, and that's the other thing, though. The Bible does not celebrate unjust poverty, but the Bible does celebrate another kind of poverty. Blessed are the poor because they are closer to God. They do not worship mammon because they don't have any mammon to worship. And and then in the monastic orders, the vow of poverty is part of what makes them leading a sacred, holy life. And this is true in other religions as well, certainly in Buddhism. So there is a good form of poverty, not grinding poverty and starvation, but a sense of limit, a sense that when we have what we need, we don't need more and more and more. And what I think Friedman is pointing to is that if we raise the standard of living of the whole world, of, say, in the immediate future, China and India, in the longer run future, the Middle East and Africa and so on, we would have a use of resources that would destroy the environment completely, and we would not have any life at all. Fouling our nest is almost too gentle a metaphor for what would happen. So we are now at the situation where, I mean, we used to talk in the 60s and so on about voluntary poverty. Voluntary poverty is still on the agenda. Being careful about the resources we use, reducing those needs that we think are needs but maybe we don't really need. If we are to share this planet with all human beings on it, and not just Americans living well while most of the world is starving, we all have to share together in some limitation on sheer material acquisitions.
There are two words that increasingly occur in lots of the discussions these days about economics and our so-called prosperity. One is simplicity. The other is sufficiency.
Yes, yes, yes.
Is it possible that if we live more simply and with just sufficiency rather than maximum wealth,
Yes.
we would in fact be happier?
Yes, yes, yes. Well, certainly we do know that while grinding poverty is a source of unhappiness, that if basic needs are met, beyond that, the more money you have doesn't make you happier. Money makes you happy if you're very poor.
And that's not just ethically
No, this
mandatory.
is just
The research shows
social
that.
psychology
Yeah.
finds this.
Right.
So that, but then we run up against the question of what is a sufficiency? Standards of the society have changed. Teenagers think they have to have their own cars. They have to have fancy audio systems. They have to have God knows what, compared to the days when you and I were growing up.
Right.
And they think that's necessary for sufficiency. So we need to really think deeply what we really need and whether a lot of the things that we now assume we really need.
I think about some of us have grandparents and parents too who grew up in a pretty poor circumstance,
Yes.
but never thought of themselves as poor
Yes, yes.
because they had enough to eat
Yes, right.
and otherwise had a happy life.
Yes.
We mustn't celebrate poverty, as I've said, but neither should we celebrate wealth the way a mammon worshiper does.
Yes, I know, because there isn't enough
Right.
there to for everyone to have that kind of extreme wealth.